So today we're going to be a little all over the Bible again. We're usually in the book of Genesis, but for the next 2 weeks, I wanted to do a couple different topical messages. For this one, I wanted to prep us for the 4th of July, which, as you all know, is Aaron's birthday. But it's also the birthday of our nation. And, it's lesser importance. But yeah, it's not, yeah. But anyway, I wanted to do a little bit of a 4th of July message today. And then next week, I was reading something that really struck me. I thought it was very beautiful, so I wanted to share about it a little bit with you guys. But it has to do with what I believe is becoming another great awakening within the West, which I think is very cool. There's a lot of bad news going around. I'll give you some good news next week. So some good stuff is happening. I also wanted to mention really quickly before I jump into this sermon, on Wednesday, I attended the Hope Night of Prayer. So Hope Church, who we partner with a little bit, those of you guys who went to our Christmas Eve service or our Good Friday service, we partnered with Hope Church as well as Ambassadors Church, which is an offshoot of Hope. And both those guys, Randy Brainerd, who's the pastor of Hope, as well as Dave Collins, who's the pastor of Ambassadors, which is really, really great guys, really godly men. And so once a month, Hope Church puts on a night of prayer at their building, and it's incredible. I was telling my wife afterwards, it was one of the best prayer nights I've ever attended. They really organize it very well. It's just a time where the church can gather and bring our heart's desires up to God, as well as some really beautiful time of praise. As we get closer to it for this month, I'll remind people, and we'll also pass out cards. So what they do is they have the church fill out cards if you want prayer for something. You can fill it out, and then that group will actually lift you up before the Lord, intercede on your behalf before God. So really, really beautiful time. And like I said, I'll remind you guys as we get closer to that time frame. But for today, as I said, it might be easier just to listen because I'm going to be going over multiple different passages. What I'm really going to focus on in this first part is the concept of patriotism. Is patriotism a good thing? Or as citizens of heaven, should we not be patriotic? Is that not a good thing for Christians to be? So I'm going to make the argument that patriotism is good. And if I have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what is unique about American patriotism, and is it actually something Christian? Is there something Christian at the foundation of our country's heritage? I may not get to all of it because there's a lot to go over. If you guys want, as always, I release an essay every week that goes over the sermon in greater detail and has a lot more quotes and all that stuff. That's available if you want to sign up for it. It's about 20 pages or something. So, if you got some free time this afternoon, you can flip it open. But let's begin with this quote. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31 through 33. It says this: "Therefore, whether we eat or drink, or whatever we do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved." The heart's cry of the Christian and the church in general is to subordinate everything within our lives to the glory of God. Even something as innocuous, even something as small as eating and drinking can be, believe it or not, done to the glory of God. This is one of the reasons why Christians pray before meals, right? We're commemorating the time to God. We're reminding ourselves of God's provision within our lives. And we're acknowledging that, yes, even something as small as this can be done to God's glory. Throughout this church, part of my vision has been community. What we really emphasize strongly at this church is the communities that form us and grow us closer to God. One day of worship a week is just not enough to make you a vibrant Christian. You need to be surrounded by good family, good friends that are helping you along in that journey and encouraging you towards God. And holidays are just this wonderful time that we get to intentionally gather together as a community and celebrate something. And sometimes those things are overtly Christian, like on Christmas or Easter. But sometimes they're just generalized good things, like, say, Mother's Day or Father's Day. They're not uniquely Christian, but they can still be uniquely celebrated by Christians for the reason that we see within family that's unique to us. I believe 4th of July is very similar, right? It is a day of patriotic fervor. It's a day where we commemorate the birth of our nation. And for that reason, I think that it's a general good, but also, like I said, it's important to argue, why is patriotism such an important thing? And so if we're going to celebrate it, we should be able to do it in a way that glorifies God and doesn't pull us away from God. So what's the concern of Christians who don't believe patriotism to be a good thing? I think the big concern would be nationalism, right? That we would become Christian nationalists and that we would elevate love of country above love for God or neighbor, that we would become, I guess you would call it like exclusionary in our belief systems, that we would be moved in a way of violence or supremacy that's bad for the world around us, right? So the word nationalist, it gets thrown around a lot, especially in the news media right now. Christian nationalism is being thrown around a lot. The word nationalist is actually derived, it's in the same category of like a racist, right? So a racist is someone who believes that their race is supreme, and therefore all other races are inferior by design, essentially. For a nationalist, it's the same thing. It's the belief that your nation is supreme over all others, and therefore it could lead to imperialistic thoughts and things like that. So many Christians believe, or have believed throughout time, that it's better to just not be patriotic, because then you avoid the sin or the vice of nationalism. But just because you avoid one sin doesn't mean you're not falling into another. So what is the other sin that you can fall into? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And in order to do that, we're going to be looking at one of the weirdest sections of the Bible, one that most people skip over. It's already in an obscure book, the book of Jeremiah, and it's the weirdest section of Jeremiah, in my opinion. Jeremiah chapter 35. You can flip there if you want. I'm just going to give you guys a rundown of what happens in this. It's a very short chapter. It's really weird, but it is incredibly informative. So if you've read the book of Jeremiah, what you realize is that God calls forth Jeremiah to prophesy to the nation of Israel at a time of extreme cultural disunity, as well as corruption at the highest levels. And Jeremiah is warning them that your guys' turn away from God, your guys' turn to idolatry has left the nation vulnerable. God is not protecting us anymore. And therefore, if you try to fight the great hegemonic power of the time, which would be the nation of Babylon, you're going to lose. You're going to be taken over. You're going to be destroyed. And so the majority of his prophetic ministry is to warn people about this. To tell them, like, don't fight because we're going to lose. In the midst of this prophetic mission, God sends him to this really weird tribe. Like I said, it's just a strange occasion, and it takes you a little bit out of the narrative. He goes to this tribe called the Rechabites. We don't know much about the Rechabites. All we really know about them is they were nomadic. They didn't really have any towns or villages. They just kind of moved around with their animals. And during this interaction, Jeremiah is commanded by God to offer them wine. And when he offers them wine, they refuse. They say, hey, look, we don't. And God, for this reason, they talk about one of their founders of the tribe and the vow that he commanded them to make. And God responds this way. So this is Jeremiah 35, verse 13 through 14. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, go and tell the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, will you not receive instruction to obey my words, says the Lord. The words of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, which he commands his sons not to drink wine, are performed. For to this day they drink none and obey their father's commandment. But although I have spoken to you rising early and speaking, you did not obey me. So God uses the Rechabites, and he says, these guys have got something down that you don't have. And I'm using their example as a means of condemning you. Well, what's the example that he's giving? It's not fidelity to God, right? What this patriarch has told the people to do is not an overtly Jewish commandment. But what God is commending here is their ability to hold to a tradition and to be faithful to the history and the heritage that they're a part of. And God's condemnation of Israel is, if they could do that for an earthly tradition, why can't you do this for a heavenly tradition? If they're able to do this for the love of a patriarch, why can't you do this for the love of me? And so he uses the Rechabites as a means of condemning his own nation. But that brings up a very important point. The love of God is an abstract concept. It's difficult to even wrap your mind around. God is not physical, he's not here. And loving him is actually kind of a difficult thing. It's hard to talk to God, it's hard to pray because God is, again, not in front of your face. It's hard to devote your life to God because he's not a person that you can know face to face. And in fact, 1 John 4, verse 12 says this: no one has seen God at any time, but if we love one another, God abides in us, and his love has been perfected in us. What John is saying is he's saying it's actually impossible to love God directly. You can't just have a relationship with God in which it's just you and him in the forest engaging in religious activity. That it doesn't work that way. God has instead left his image upon the earth in the form of human beings, and we learn to love God by loving others. We become prepared, if you want to put it this way. We're prepared to love God through intermediary relationships. This is one of the reasons why God uses so many different metaphors to describe himself and to describe the love that he has for us. In some instances, he talks about himself like he's a shepherd. In some instances, he talks about himself like he's a potter and he's forming clay. In other instances, he's a father. In other instances, he's a friend. In other instances, he's a savior. And yes, in some instances, he is a king. What that means is that by loving these particular things, it prepares my heart to love God in those particular ways. So if I learn how to create anything from drawing a picture to making pottery to making something out of wood or plastic or metal or whatever, the love that you pour into a created object prepares you to understand what kind of love God has for you as his creation and how he forms you. Right? If you have a child, you're becoming prepared to love God in that paternal way, the way he loves us as a father. When you have friends, it prepares your heart to love God as a friend. And when you learn to honor the rulers and dignitaries of your nation, when you learn to respect the country that you're from and to honor it, it prepares you to love the heavenly nation that we belong to and the King of all other kings. If you deny those intermediaries, though, if you say, like, well, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to try to love God directly, you're actually denying yourself access to the abstract love of God. That's what John is warning about. He's saying, we haven't seen God at any time. You can't say or claim that you just love God directly. It doesn't work like that. In fact, later on in the book, he says, if you say you love God, but you hate your brother, you're a liar, and the truth isn't in you. So there were many religious people who were treating other people like junk, and they were leaving their families, abandoning their families in order to live a life apart from community so that they can just be connected to God in a one-on-one way. And John and the other apostles are saying, no, you're not loving God. You're loving your version of God. You're loving your projection of God, but you're not loving God. Because God's image is on your brother who you can see. He's sitting right next to you. And if you can't love that image, how can you say you love the one of whom the image is representative of? It's not possible to do. If you hate without cause, right? If you hate without cause your earthly father, and you haven't learned appropriately to love your earthly father, you're not prepared to love your heavenly Father either. If you hate without cause the country that you were born into, you're not going to be ready to love the heavenly country that you're being called to. Right? The intermediary loves prepare us for the multifaceted heavenly love of God. Well, let's go back to the danger real quick before we move on. There's again that danger of tribalism or nationalism. This is what Jesus warns about. John 14, verse 26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Now, there's two ways to take this verse. One is ridiculous. The other makes a whole lot of sense. You could take it at face value, and that's the ridiculous interpretation. You could actually believe that what Jesus is saying is if you want to love him more, actively hate your friends and family. That's clearly a ridiculous interpretation of that passage. It doesn't work. Jesus would never tell his followers, hey, if you're a husband, start hating your wife, right? If you're a father, start hating your kids, and then you're becoming more ready for my eternal love. That's not what he's saying. What he's getting at is he's using hyperbole. He's saying the love for God that the Christian has must be so supreme that it subordinates all other loves. That the love that I have for my wife is no longer an end, but a means. I love God by loving my wife. I love God by loving my country. I love God by loving my father and mother. It's now a means to the ultimate end as opposed to an end unto itself. And this is, again, where all these things become bad. So I'm going to use family love for a second to help understand this. In most pagan nations, there's a form of ancestor worship. There's a belief that your ancestors are in some way watching over you, that you can commune with them, and that they can actually intercede in the world on your behalf. And a lot of the areas that Christianity goes into melds that into it, right? So a good example of this would be the Day of the Dead. We're from a border town. We should understand this, right? The Day of the Dead, celebrated by Mexican nationals. What is it? It's a day where they commune with the dead, right? They believe that they can actually have fellowship with their ancestors. They could actually leave out gifts and presents for them. And if you've seen the movie Coco, you know all about this, right? And that's how you do it. That's how you celebrate this particular day. Well, what happens when you worship your ancestry? So I'm looking at the audience. There's a lot of white people here. White people don't tend to understand this very much. We don't really have ancestor worship as a part of our heritage. Some people do, right, if you're Italian or something like that. But for the most part, white people have left this long in the past. But if you hang out with more traditional cultures, Greek, Italian, right, Hispanic, Indian, Asian, right, you hang out with them, you realize that there's a heavy veneration of ancestry as well as family. And there's a lot of good there. There's a lot of good there when you hang out with a family that does that well. But there's also some not so good stuff. One of the worst things that happens in families like that is they will defend family members to the death, right? Even when the family members are clearly in the wrong, right? Even when family members should be excised and thrown out and condemned, they will still protect that family member. Oh, it's just Uncle Johnny. Well, no, like Uncle Johnny needs to get corrected. But they can't do that because they venerate their family. They even cover over embarrassing elements of family history. They'll pretend like it's not there, right? Which is, again, not so good. This is an example of, like I said, when veneration of family, loving your family, which is a good thing, has become an ultimate thing. And by becoming an ultimate thing, it's become a bad thing. Patriotism would work the same way, right? Someone who is nationalistic can't admit to the flaws within their nation. They support it no matter what. They are diehard fans, if you want to put it that way. They can't admit when the country is doing something wrong. And therefore, they hold to that belief, even when it makes no sense. Now, because our country is a little bit interesting, people don't tend to be nationalists in that sense. They tend to be, what do you call it, like affiliates of a particular political ideology, right? So they'll defend their political side no matter what, even if it's clearly ridiculous. But they'll condemn the other side no matter what, even if it's clearly correct, right? That's the idea of venerating something to the place of God. There is only one being in the universe who needs no defense, and that's God, right? God does not need defense. He doesn't need you and me to defend him and to pretend like the stuff that he does is great, because everything he does is legitimately great. Okay, so God needs no defense. God needs no excuses. God is always going to do the righteous and holy thing. And therefore, he is the only one in the universe to whom absolute devotion is owed. Every other institution, no matter how great, whether it's the family, the country, or even the church itself, to venerate it is to put something in the place that only God deserves to be. And that is exactly what Jesus is warning about. He's not saying to hate your father and mother, but he is saying the love for your father and mother must be in submission to me. And that means sometimes loving your father and mother, loving your brother and sister, loving your kids is going to mean correcting them, calling them out, Because if loving them actually means enabling sinful behaviors, you're not loving God by loving them. You're actually sinning against God by enabling their failures. It's a bigger topic that we could get into, but we won't. What happens when you throw it out, though? What happens when you throw out family love, love for nation, things like that? These intermediary concepts that prepare the heart for loving God. Do people become more virtuous or less? Well, throughout the last couple hundred years, there's been a weird resurgence of the first heresy that existed and afflicted the early church, the Gnostic heresy. So the Gnostics were a group of Greek philosophers who believed exactly what I'm saying. The flesh doesn't matter. Your family doesn't matter. Your friends don't matter. The only thing that matters is God and the things of God. So I don't love true things. I love truth itself. I don't love just actions. I love justice itself in the abstract, in this really high way of talking. And so they distanced themselves from their heritage and their culture and their families, and they believed that that was more holy. The majority of your New Testament was written to condemn this attitude. So Christians were like, well, I don't need to keep being a servant. You know, Jesus has set me free. There's neither slave nor free, male nor female. I don't need to listen to that guy. I have a high king that I listen to. So I'm going to shirk my responsibilities at my job. And the apostles have to come back and say, no. Whatever you do, do heartily as unto the Lord, Colossians chapter 3. Right? They encourage the people of like, if you're going to be a Christian servant, if you're going to be a Christian employee, you better be the best employee that you possibly can be, because that's how you honor God. Right? Some children, this is what Jesus has condemned the Pharisees about. Some kids were like, well, I know I'm supposed to take care of my mom and dad, but I think what I'm instead going to do is give all my money to charity, and I'm not going to take care of them in their old age. And Jesus says, no, you've nullified the word of God through the tradition of man. That's not right. Your money is supposed to go to supporting your family. Other Christians were having that same idea. And in 1 Timothy 5, Paul has to condemn them. If someone doesn't take care of their own, even the members of their own household, they have denied the faith, and they're worse than a non-believer. So this was the ideas going on, though. You don't need to love your country. You don't need to love your family. You don't need to love anything but God. And the apostles are saying, no, that's actually a really bad idea. That's going to destroy you. What's it going to lead to? So Paul predicts what this ideology will eventually lead to. And one of the most fascinating passages in the New Testament. A lot of people quote this one because they think it's who we are today. And that's true. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 says this, but know this, that in the last days, perilous times will come. Okay, so last days, as we're getting closer to the return of Christ, dangerous times are going to come. What's going to cause them? Men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal. By the way, the word brutal means they can't keep promises. That's literally what that word means. They can't keep promises. Despisers of good, traitors, right, to their own nations, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasures rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. And from such people turn away. So notice he's saying this is going to permeate in the last days, but he's saying it is now. There's people who think that way now, and you got to turn away from them. What's he condemning? This Gnostic heresy that I'm talking about. They have the form of godliness. Well, I just love God. I just love God. Well, your family's a mess. Well, I'm just loving the Lord. I don't have time for my family. Paul's like, no, turn away from that guy. Right? That's not good. That's not godly. Because the love of God is created, it's formed through the love of your fellow man, through these intermediary institutions that prepare you to love the Lord correctly. And Paul is saying that when we lose that, this is what's going to happen to the people of that generation. And again, it's not really something I feel like I have to argue. When you look at that list, does that not sound a little bit like where we're at today? Right? And anyone who says otherwise, you're clearly living in a very, very beautiful bubble that I don't want to pop. But for most of us, we would read that and be like, yeah, it sounds a lot like the world that we're living in. Well, the world that we're living in is promoting these same globalist ideas. You don't have to love your country, you love mankind in general. You see, you don't have to love your family, you just love everyone. I just love everybody. Well, if you love everybody, you might end up loving nobody. Right? There are needs that people have, and you can't actually love everybody the same. To love every child the same as my child is to not love my child. I have to love them more than any other child because they only have one dad. I can't look at them with this utopian fantasy and saying, well, the world is your father. No, it's not. I'm their dad. I have to love them more than any other child. Otherwise, I'm failing them as a father. Right? You only have one nation. You can't love every other nation equally. It doesn't work that way. If you have some real free time this weekend and you want to get into something dense, read True Virtue or versus Common Virtue by Jonathan Edwards. It's a read. It's a little complicated, but basically the argument that he makes is that true virtue, genuine virtue, can only be achieved if you love being itself, right? Life itself. But he says, since that's impossible for a human being to do, the only way for us to achieve it is to love God. And by loving God, we're connected to the one who loves the universe. Right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Right? But you must take seriously the responsibilities that are nearest to you. You must love your family more than other people's families. You must love your friends more than other people's friends. And that's what God is designed for us. We as Christians ought to be patriotic because patriotism prepares us for the higher love that God has reserved for the citizens of his kingdom. Many Christians have walked away from that, though. They believe like, no, I am a servant of the great and mighty King of the universe. I don't have to worry about what's going on in the here and now. Well, how's that worked out for our nation? How's that worked out for our country? The more Christians become the more Christians become apolitical, what has the political situation looked like for the past 100 years that we've adopted that ideology? Has it been good or has it been bad? Right? And again, I would make the argument that it hasn't been too good for us. Right? We, as Christians, we're supposed to be patriots, but we're supposed to be true patriots. And that means that we love God more than our country. And therefore, we're going to fight correctly to instantiate the right values within our nation. And we will criticize our country when it comes down to it. Jeremiah, by the way, if you just want to read the book from start to finish, it's the most patriotic book in the Bible, in my opinion. It is so patriotic. Jeremiah loves his country. He loves his country. Now, after spoiler alert, after the Babylonians conquer Israel, they actually think Jeremiah is awesome because they're like, hey, there's this dude walking around saying that everyone should have surrendered to us. That's amazing, right? And they want to make him a Babylonian mascot, basically, and send it back to Babylon. And he refuses. He says, no. My people are the Israelites. I'm not going to be with you guys. I will serve my country above all others. But his love for his country was second to his love for God. And that's what allowed him to actually criticize his country when he needed to do it and fight to make his country better, even when it cost him his life. And God praises Jeremiah's heart for that. He never looks at Jeremiah and says, Jeremiah, you love your country too much. Stop it. Right? He always praises Jeremiah for having that beautiful, wonderful heart for his country and fighting a battle that was doomed from the start. Right? Jeremiah is heroic for that purpose. We don't condemn him or loathe him for that. So as Christians, when we move towards a celebration like the 4th of July, it should remind us of that we have a godly calling to be patriots, but true patriots. Right? Not the types of patriots that will just give into whatever the country wants us to give into, but patriots who serve God supremely and therefore serve our country correctly. A more modern version of this would be a guy like, I quote him a lot because I think he was awesome, Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany, right? He was a true patriot of the German nation. And when Germany started instituting anti-Jewish propaganda, he resisted them. And if you read his essays, which are fantastic, by the way, especially The Church and the Jewish Question, which is phenomenal, He argues that it's his position as a patriot that's making him oppose the Nazis. He actually says the church, this is a phrase in his essay, he says, the church is the most faithful servant of the state. And he says, and that's why we have to oppose it. It's a radical, radical concept. Or you could just watch The Sound of Music, which I did again, which is a great movie, right? But Sound of Music is the same thing, right? He's a great patriot, but he has to resist the Nazis because of what they were doing to the country of Austria. So that's kind of a generalized defense of patriotism. But how about America in particular? Is there anything special about America that Christians should be happy about? Or not? Or are we just one nation amongst many? So I don't have time to get into all of them. But in my paper, I pull out three. Right? I believe that America has a unique godly heritage in three different ways, right? And there are more, but these are the biggest in my opinion. Universal human worth, presumed human corruption, and finally, an emphasis on personal liberty and autonomy. So let's run through these as quickly as I can. But before I do want to distinguish what I'm about to say with another movement that's very well-meaning, but I disagree with it. So a couple years ago, a book came out called The Harbinger. It was like a New York Times bestseller, I think. It was really, really popular. And it was making the argument that America is a Christian nation in the same way that Israel was a Jewish nation. And he even argued that we are contained within the prophetic scriptures of the Bible. Now, I disagree with him. I disagree with that ideology. We are not a Christian nation in the way that Israel was a Jewish nation. Israel was founded through incredible miracles. They were led through the wilderness and fed manna. That didn't happen to our troops, unfortunately. There was some cool stuff that happened in American founding, but that's not one of them. Moses was given the 10 Commandments on a mountain that God touched and actually wrote the 10 Commandments with his fingertip and presented him with the law of Israel personally. That didn't happen to our founders, right? So there's a lot of differences between our founders and the Israelites. We are not a theocracy. We were not founded in that way because of the way that Jesus established the church. So there's many others I could go through. But that doesn't mean that America doesn't have a uniquely godly heritage. We absolutely do. The men who founded our country, whether they were deistic, which some of them were, or devout Christians, which some of them also were, they were all immersed in Christian culture. They were all raised on the Bible. They all knew the scriptures, and they created and crafted the nature of our system based on those principles. They weren't just generic deists. They weren't just reading the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and just like all these various religious texts and pulling something out of their hat. That's not what happened. They were immersed in Scripture. That's where they got the founding of our nation. So again, I'm just going to go through three of these to elaborate. So let's start with universal human worth. So I'm going to do a quote from the Bible and then a quote from our founders to show what they're thinking about when they're saying what they're saying. Genesis 9, verse 6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For the image of God, God made man. And this is from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the pagan view that the Judaic-Christian view is opposed to is that only the elites matter. So the language of image of God is used by pagans, but it only applies to the kings. It only applies to the rulers of a given society. Only the Jewish faith taught that all men were made in the image of God. This commandment is given to Noah, who is traditionally the father of all nations, right? He's not specifically the father of the Jewish nation. He is the father of all nations. And this commandment is given to him. There is universal human worth within the scriptures. Now, this idea bent so far against the traditional human idea of human nature that it took hundreds of years for this idea to finally, thousands of years for this idea to finally work its way out into our culture. But if you look at every culture has practiced slavery. Every culture has practiced imperialism, conquering other nations willy-nilly and enslaving the inhabitants. Every culture has practiced some sort of human sacrifice of their conquered foes. All these cultures have done these things. Only the Judeo-Christian cultures have gotten rid of these things because our ideas are unique. They're different. They're not like all the others. They believe that they insist that all of humanity has equal worth before God because we all equivalently bear the image of God and we should be respected. Not even the government can infringe on that. So if you read the whole Declaration of Independence, the founders argued that they had not just the right, the responsibility to fight against the English government because they were removing natural rights from the citizenry. That's built into our DNA, that if the government ever removes the rights of the people have the responsibility to oppose that because we have universal human worth. Now, the argument that many people today will make against that point, that contention, is they'll say, well, come on, you're not going to say the founders really believe that. We practiced slavery for a while. We oppressed indigenous peoples. We sent them off to reservations. What about the Trail of Tears? What about all the evils within American history? I'm not going to argue against any of those. They're all true. The question isn't, did America actually do those things, which again is inarguable. The question is, were the words of the founders hypocritical, or were the actions of the founders hypocritical? Well, recently, many people have made the argument that the words themselves were hypocritical, that the founders were hypocrites and evil men. About 4 or 5 years ago, the 1619 Project was formed. They were one of these, it's been around for a while, but they were one of the more prominent ones. One of the founders is a woman named Nicole Hannah-Jones. This is a quote from the 1619 Project. She says this: "Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have had to fight to make them true." So what's her argument? America's evil, right? That's her argument. America's evil. It's evil at the roots. All the promises are fake, and we need to rewrite the system because there's nothing proud about American heritage. We have a system of slavery and oppression that we need to undo. In fact, the whole reason why they call it the 1619 Project, in case you wanted to know, is because they believe that 1776 is not the actual founding of America. They believe that 1619 was when the first black slaves were brought over to our country. They actually argue that 1776 was when the white racist founders of America fought against the British Crown in order to preserve slavery in our country. So they don't have a very high view of American history. They actually kind of hate our country. And many children, by the way, who attend the school system now are being taught to hate their country. Right? They're being taught to actually hate their country because they think that that's a good thing, that we achieve the higher ideals by hating the intermediates. And that's just not true. Well, is that how the abolitionists saw it? Right? So if you read Frederick Douglass, if you read Harriet Tubman, if you read W.E.B. Du Bois, if you read Martin Luther King, what was their message? Is it that America is inherently racist and so we need to get away from it? Or is it that America is inherently good, but we've been hypocritical in our application of our promises? Well, without boring you with all of their quotes, I'll just skip to Martin Luther King. But all of them say essentially the same thing. This is from his famous letter from Birmingham jail. He says, "One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at the lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, and thus carrying our whole nation back to the great wells of democracy, which were dug by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence." Sounds like he kind of likes our country, right? The guy who did the most to fight for equal rights for black citizens believed that the founding principles of our country were Christian. And he cared so deeply about our country because he wanted us to go back to that. He wanted to reform the promises of our founding fathers that had been corrupted by the wickedness of human nature. Okay, what about presumed human fallenness? And by the way, the church represents the soul of a particular nation. That's what we represent. We represent the soul of the nation. The laws that a nation creates are crafted through interaction with the soul of the nation. And that's what the church is supposed to be. When you remove the soul of the country, the laws that come out of it are undermined and they're distorted. So again, let me ask you the question. As Christianity has become increasingly sidelined, have racial tensions increased or decreased in the last 30 years or so? I grew up in the 90s. It wasn't perfect, but you know what? Racial tensions were pretty low in the 90s. They were actually fairly good. I don't remember even talking about it in school, and there were kids of all races within my class. Now it seems like that's all we talk about. So as Christianity becomes increasingly sidelined, racial tensions don't go down, they seem to go up. Why? Because only Christianity teaches that all men are made in the image and likeness of God. No other religion teaches that. If you remove the soul, you've sawed down the branch from which all the fruit was emerging from. Next, presumed human fallenness. This is Romans 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all have sinned, right? We're all sinners before a just and holy God. We all need salvation through faith in Jesus Christ because we are born in sin. It's presumed in the Bible. It doesn't say that Jesus died for just the wicked people out there. He says he died for the whole world because the whole world stands condemned before a just and holy God. Well, what did the founders think about that? This is from the famous Federalist Papers. This is James Madison, who was, in my opinion, the most bright of all the founding fathers. He says this: it may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary either. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control of the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Everything about our system, if people are frustrated about it, they're like, gosh, it seems so inefficient. It takes forever to do anything in our country. We change out administration so quickly that they can't get anything done. Politicians spend half their time campaigning and then like a quarter of their time actually doing the job. This sounds really, really dumb. That's a feature, not a bug. That's how they designed it. That's what James Madison said. He said, we have created a system designed to frustrate the powerful. Why? Since mankind is inherently fallen, if you localize power in any individual or body of politic, it will become corrupt by that nature. And so it has to stand at odds towards other interests so that the corruption doesn't become too great too quickly. The whole system was created to be inefficient because people are terrible. Is it good that people are efficient? Think about it this way. You could give particular power tools to your child to make their chores more efficient. As a parent, will you do it? No, right? You want to frustrate them because you want them to be inefficient in their chores. Because, yeah, they'll maybe be able to do good things quickly, but they'll also be able to do bad things very quickly, right? So maybe you don't want to do that. That's what James Madison is saying. He's saying we can't give too much power to any institution because if we do that, the corruption will spread too quickly. They presumed that people are terrible. That was the presumption. So when Christians say, well, America is a Christian nation, it is, but not the way you're thinking. It's based around, it's not saying that capitalism is the best way to create morality or virtue, because frankly, it's not. But it is the best way to limit the corruption of the people that have the power. Right? It's good to separate it out. It's good that the government doesn't have access to all of capital. It's good that the people are checked by the government and the government is checked by the people. Right? It's good that these interests exist. It's also good, this is something that Christians struggle with, that the church and the state are two separate entities. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that there's not a Church of America, that the president is the high priest of. That's a very good thing. Yeah, you all laugh because you know it's ridiculous, but That's how every nation used to function. You go to England, there's a Church of England, right? Every nation used to have a state church that the political leader was also the leader of. The reason why we laugh is because we're like, our politicians in charge of a church? That would be a disaster. That's right, because politicians are a disaster for the most part, right? There's some good eggs out there, but for the most part, they're a bit of a disaster. We don't want them to be in charge of the church. That would be a bad thing. Okay? So the separation of church and state that the founders instituted, it wasn't to protect the state from the church, it was to protect the church from the state. Right? Read their writings. They're very clear about it. I could go through several, but since we're low on time, I'll just do one. This is John Adams, a letter to the Massachusetts militia. He sent this in about 1798. He says this, because we have no government armed with power, capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion, avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale going through a net. Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It was wholly inadequate to the government of any other. What's he saying? In order for the government to be limited, the people have to be able to govern themselves. And in order for the people to govern themselves, they have to have a separate institution that raises them in morality. Is it really a good idea that the government teaches us morality? Now we shake our heads, but there's a reason why. For all of church history, the church educated children. It's only in the 1900s that changed. All education is moral education. And when the church fails to understand that that's the case, guess what? The education that the kids are receiving is state education. And that means their moral education is state-run. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, like, dude, we didn't prepare a government to deal with people that aren't moral. We didn't prepare it because a government has to be much more powerful to govern people who can't govern themselves. And again, if you're looking around and you're saying, like, look at all these crazy riots, and people are like, wow, like, these college campuses are kind of nuts. That's your elites. Those are your future leaders you're talking about. Where do you think those people are going after they graduate? Right? They're going to run the major corporations. Many of us in this room work for those people, those kids that graduate college and take over big companies. When you lose self-control, the government has to step in. That's the whole point. If you don't want the government stepping in, well, then the church has to step up. That's how the founders designed it. This goes hand in hand, personal liberty. So again, we're celebrating Independence Day. Right? This is the whole idea of the American experiment, is that personal liberty can trump all else. Well, why is that so important? Galatians 5, verse 13. For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. The Bible is a liberation text. It is the most freeing religious text ever written. It has so much emphasis on it. The central text in the Bible is the Exodus. It's the deliverance of slavery to freedom. Jesus, when he came on the scene, he was very clear that he is the new Moses. That's why he was crucified on the Passover celebration. The whole Christian gospel is about people being set free. Why is that so important? Because our God does not desire obedience, but love. The central commandment of Christianity that Jesus gives, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. He could have said the first and greatest commandment is obey God, or otherwise he'll kill you, and take care of your neighbor because that's what you're supposed to do. But he doesn't say that. He says love God. The problem is that you can only love when you're free. The prerequisite for genuine affection and love is freedom. If I tied my wife up in the bottom of our house and chained her there and I said, man, she loves me so much. And you're like, well, how do you know she loves you, Peter? She never leaves me. She never even thinks about it. It's amazing. You'd be like, well, she's not free to leave you. So therefore, it's not love, right? Love is only love when it's free. This again, I like quoting things like this because I'm weird. Beauty and the Beast, right? Belle can't love the beast until he lets her go, right? In order to love, you must be free. It was very important that God set us free from the laws of sin and death, that we might enter into a covenant with him that's built upon his faithfulness and not our own. That freedom gives you the ability to love God, to really love him. And that's what God wants above all else. The founders understood something. If we restrict, if we make people be good, if we force people to be good, we might have a better country, but we have a less free country. And because we have a less free country, we have a less virtuous country. And because we have a less virtuous country, we have a less godly country. You have to be free to be virtuous. And here's another kicker. You got to be virtuous to be free. What Paul's saying, he's saying, man, if you use your liberty to serve your flesh, guess what? You lose your liberty. You put yourself in bondage to something. The drug addict is free to do what he wants. But by being free to do what he wants, he now is unable to do what he needs. You use liberty in the wrong way, you get bondage. If you use liberty in the right way, it leads you on to virtue and godliness. The founders were very worried about making people not just good in the sense we do the right thing, right? You can have a totalitarian regime that forces virtue, for sure, and there are many countries that do that, and our country's trying to do that, but you can't actually do it. In order for people to be virtuous, they must be free. And as the foundations of Christianity are being eroded, you're seeing the worst of both worlds. Wild debauchery and licentiousness on one side, and heavier government crackdown on the other side. And it's happening at the same time. And you're like, well, how could they be happening at the same time? Because that's what has to happen. A country that can't govern themselves needs a powerful government to step in and force virtue. I don't like that. I like the fact, as God created the universe for freedom, that means that he had to allow people to do some bad stuff. Why? So that they could also be free to do right stuff. I like living in a free country because it gives me the ability to be virtuous in authenticity to God. That my conscience to God can be shaped not by a political order, but by a religious one. That's what the founders intended, and that's what we're supposed to have. So as Christians, when we enter into 4th of July, to celebrate patriotism is a very beautiful thing. To instill in oneself as well as in your kids a love for their country is a beautiful thing. But to also remember and to keep in mind, what are the foundations of our nation that are worth preserving and fighting for? Right? And that way we as a church can actively pray about that and to seek these things in a way that honors and glorifies God. Let's pray. Father, we love you and we're grateful for you. We're thankful, Lord, that you have given us these beautiful things within our world. God, you've given us a